All right, it says I'm live, so we'll see. Um, yeah, trying out a new camera angle this time to try to see if I can get better lighting, better keyboard access, all that stuff, so I don't fumble with the camera like I did last time. So hopefully it's not too strange of an angle. Anyway, again, I'm having trouble with the stream running my HD camera. My computer doesn't seem to process it correctly. So if you're watching now or later, maybe watch it in lower resolution. Maybe it'll come out a little bit cleaner as far as the syncing between my words in the video. Anyway, sorry about that. I'm working out the bugs as I go here. um, so tonight I'm going to do this is part two of Revelation Outside the Box. I guess it's officially a series. I wanted to delve more in detail into chapter 12. And I mentioned the first go round that Revelation has a chiastic structure. And if you don't remember what that is, or if you haven't seen that stream, a chiasm is basically it's like a mirror image. Like if you're writing a poem, your writing scheme would be something like A B B A, or like A B C B A. Basically, like your first and your last stanzas would be similar, and then your B sections would be similar. And the idea with a chiasm is that you do have like a narrative that goes along linearly. At the same time, thematically, it can also be read front to back and then back to front, meeting at the middle. And where it meets in the middle, that's where the core of the action is. That's where the overall main message of the piece is. That's where it wants you to focus in on. So in Revelation, that happens to be in those middle chapters between 10 and 13. That's what I got into last time. But I've been studying it a little bit farther, and I've kind of come to see that Revelation 12 is actually really the main crux of it. This is like the climax of the whole thing. That might seem a little strange to you because Revelation 22 seems pretty awesome. But this is like where the main action comes in. This is where you have, I think, the second Exodus revealed, and I'm going to get into that here and show hopefully why. Um, for those of you who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, of course, obviously, we had the first Exodus out of Egypt a few thousand years ago with Pharaoh and Moses, Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston. And we had that, and it was awesome. Yahweh brought them out of Israel or out of Egypt with a mighty hand, part of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, led them through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, gave them the Torah, entered into covenant with them, eventually brought them into the land. And there are several prophecies that indicate that that's going to happen again in a much bigger scale, a scale so large that it will make people forget about that first one. So that's what I want to kind of get into tonight. Um, if you are not familiar with the concept of the two houses of Israel, just a quick refresher. After Solomon passed away, King Solomon, the kingdom was split into two parts: the northern kingdom of 12 tribes under King Jeroboam, the southern kingdom of 2 tribes under King Rehoboam, Solomon's son. And the 10 tribes of the north were called Israel, the house of Israel. Alternately, they were called the house of Joseph, the house of Ephraim, kind of used all interchangeably. The southern kingdom was the kingdom of Judah, typically called Judah, obviously, later to be known as the Jews. And they were split. And the house of Israel, the northern kingdom, was put into dispersion by the Assyrians in about 721 BC. And they kind of assimilated into the nations around the world where they were spread. They kind of lost their identity. The house of Judah to the south was eventually taken to Babylon. They got to come back, but they never really lost their identity. There are some people that say that they did. I'm just going to go with the status quo and say that the people that say that they are Jews are actually Jews, generally. I know you have the whole Khazar thing, but I'm not going to get into that. Oh no, my nose is already itchy. I'm having trouble again. Um, anyway, so that's kind of the backdrop of this, okay? And the prophets talk about almost universally that in the last days, when we have Yahweh's kingdom set up on earth, and yes, I did say on earth, it's a biblical concept, that you will have the whole kingdom brought back together. The two sticks of Ezekiel chapter 37. There are multiple other prophecies that detail it. So that's what I'm going to be getting into tonight, and I'm going to try to show that happening from the book of Revelation, at least in a specific context. To show you what I'm talking about, I'm just going to give you a couple sample prophecies here to kind of whet your appetite. There are many more. You can do just basic word searches, like in Blue Letter Bible. You can go online. There are articles about it where people line out all the scriptures. I'm going to give three just to kind of get us started here. I'm going to start in Isaiah chapter 11, in verse 11, and I'll just read them all. Then it will happen on that day that Yahweh will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and from the islands of the sea. And he will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass Ephraim. They will swoop down on the slopes of the Philistines on the west. Together they will plunder the sons of the east. They will possess Edom and Moab, and the sons of Ammon will be subject to them. And Yahweh will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, the Nile River, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind. And he will strike it into 7 streams, and make men walk over dry shod. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who will be left, just as there was for Israel in the day that they came up from the land of Egypt. So just some kind of points I want to emphasize here, okay? He's talking about the remnant of his people coming from, he lists a few nations here. With the exception of the islands of the sea, these are all nations that are adjacent to Israel. Okay, so these are like the neighbors. It makes sense if you're going to enter Israel, you need to go through one of these nations first if you're coming by land. Now, what do we do with the islands of the sea? I don't really know yet, but I do think it's interesting that he talks about drying up the Nile, basically, so that men can walk over dry shod. The only reason he would need to do that would be as if you had people coming from west of the Nile, basically out of the Sahara Desert. And I find that really interesting that there's going to be a remnant coming from that direction that would need to cross the Nile to get into the land of Israel as part of this Exodus. So I don't know quite what to make of that, but I think it's really interesting. You have the highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people. So I mean, it ties in a lot with Egypt. You know, you have the drying up of a sea. You have the people being brought in. You have those same 3 nations, Ammon, Edom, and Moab. Those were relevant in the conquest of the land. They had to kind of go around them because they wouldn't let them through. So something to think about there. The next one that just jumps out at me is in Jeremiah chapter 16. Go there. Verse 14. Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when it will no longer be said, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as Yahweh lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. Now, from Israel, if you go north, you get into the Caucasus Mountains generally, you get into Turkey, you can get into Russia, but you also can get into Europe. And so I think the land of the north is that general area. If you look historically, when Ephraim, the house of Israel, was scattered by the Assyrians, they did stay in the Near East over there. Some of them potentially went further east in towards China. But a lot of them went north up through the Caucasus Mountains, and there's good evidence that a lot of Europeans are from that stock genetically. Now, does it mean a ton? It sort of does because Yahweh promised that to a nation. They are a people biologically, but at the same time, we know that you can be cut off from Israel and you can be grafted into Israel. So it's not saying that only Caucasians are in, because that would be by DNA. We know that that's not what it is. We know that ultimately it's by faith. But these are the remnants of these 2 people groups that he's talking about here, biologically at least, okay? So he's talking about bringing people in from the north country and then the nations surrounding Israel. And it's going to be so epic, it's going to make people forget about the first one. So as awesome as that first one was, whatever Yahweh is going to do here is just going to dwarf it. It's just going to trump it. Um, so I find that awesome. And then we'll go to the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea is all about Yahweh dealing with the house of Israel, the northern tribes. This was before the Assyrian captivity. And he talks about, I'll start in chapter 11, verse 8. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me, all my compassions are kindled. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again. For I am Elohim and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. They will walk after Yahweh. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar. And his sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will settle them in their houses, declares Yahweh. So if you look at a map of Israel, due west is the Mediterranean. So what nations are there? None. Now, if you keep going straight, eventually you hit America, okay? But we're not just going to be able just to waltz right in there. It is interesting that he talks about coming from the west, and he talks about coming from Egypt, and then he also talks about Assyria. So if you're coming, if the Exodus, if you're up in Europe when it starts and you're headed towards Israel, you're going to be coming through the land of Assyria to get to Israel. If you are coming from the west, potentially, you're going to be coming through Africa. I mentioned earlier the Nile being dried up so people can walk over. Well, they're coming from west of the Nile out towards the Sahara. So I'm wondering if that's what this is talking about, if you're going to have Ephraimites coming from that direction. Now, how that works with the Sahara Desert there, I don't know, but that could be part of the miracle here. You know, that could be part of the miracle. Yahweh getting these people through the Sahara Desert. That's definitely a wilderness. And if anyone can do it, he can do it. So I'm not ruling that out. We're open-minded here. So those are just three examples just to kind of set you up on what I'm talking about when I say second Exodus, okay? Yahweh is going to gather all his people. There will be biological Israelites, biological Jews from the house of Judah brought in here. There will also be the mixed multitudes grafted in. Just like the first Exodus, you had the mixed multitude. Mixed multitude was there at Mount Sinai when they entered into covenant with Yahweh. It wasn't just the Jews. It wasn't even just Israel. So if we're looking at that as a type and a shadow of what's coming, we can expect the same thing with the second Exodus. Okay. So to set the stage there, now I'm going to get into Revelation 12. I'm going to try to keep this study relatively short because I do want to get into, it's already 10:30. I do want to get into, if I have time, the mark of the beast, the number of the beast that was requested, and I want to address it before I forget while it's fresh in my mind. So I'm just going to start reading in chapter 12, and I might kind of make some points addressing other scriptures from other chapters here just to kind of connect stuff. But my core emphasis is going to be on chapter 12. And I'm going to try to show where this ties in with the first Exodus, the second Exodus, and maybe some additional information as far as potential timing of the whole thing. So stay tuned for that. Verse 1, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Now, I mentioned before in the last teaching that there are a lot of people who thought that this was some kind of a star sign, like a constellation, the constellation Virgo with the planet Jupiter, some stars, et cetera, et cetera. That supposedly happened last year. A memory popped up on Facebook a while ago from my page where I guess back in 2017, I posted skeptically of the same thing happening then. You know, it happens pretty much every year, it seems like. People are talking about this sign happening. And what's happened? Has our 1,260 days started? No. So when you read about the angels later that have the seven, it's either I think it's the trumpets. It specifically says that was a sign in heaven. So is that a constellation? Don't think so. Consistently, we're not looking at a constellation here. We're just looking at something that John is seeing symbolically. Okay. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 crowns. And his tail sweeps away a third of the stars of heaven and throws them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. I want to make a quick note. In the Greek, some of these verbs are in a present tense. In English, they get translated as past tense, but they're actually present tense in Greek. So I'm going to read them that way, the best I can in present tense where they're there. So if you're reading along and you notice that, that's what's going on. Verse 5. And she gave birth to a son, a male, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to Elohim and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by Elohim, so that there she would be nourished for 1,002. Now, it should be pretty obvious if you're a believer in the Messiah that the one who was talking about here is that's caught up to Elohim, to Yahweh, to his throne, that's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's Yahshua. Okay, that's the Messiah. That's pretty clear. Okay, now the woman, I believe that this is symbolic of Israel in general. I base that on Joseph's dream about the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars. He would also be one of those stars, so 12 stars total for the 12 tribes, representing all Israel. That's my assumption, and I think a lot of people agree with that. Not everybody, though, but that's where I'm at. I think it's Israel. So this, to me, is talking about the Messiah coming forth from Israel, okay? And I'm going to come back to this spot a little bit later when we talk about the timing. There was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place for them found in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our Elohim and the authority of his Messiah have come, and the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our Elohim day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Now, it's commonly taught, I've heard this pretty much my whole life, that this whole thing here is describing the red dragon talks about sweeping a third of the stars. The stars are angels. So this goes back before creation when Lucifer, the devil, rebelled against God, and he was kicked out of heaven. He brought a third of his angels with him who rebelled. They're now demons, etc., etc. The whole context of this is not past tense. I know some of the verbs read past tense, but if you look at the entire context, this is future tense. Okay? Because he's talking about accusing the brethren. There were no brethren. This is talking about humans, presumably. We weren't around, supposedly, when Lucifer fell. So this is not past tense. This is something that's still coming. Okay? And you see a parallel with this. Michael standing up. This is parallel with Daniel chapter 12. You know, I think. So there's a this is clearly coming. This is not past tense. So when we read this thing as something that's coming in the future, then it's a game changer to me. It's a game changer. I'm going to pause there, and to tie this in with the Exodus, I want to back up a minute here. Assuming that the woman is Israel, okay, let's go back to the first Exodus. Let's go back to the book of Exodus. You can turn there and read it if you want. I'm not going to go and read it. We all know the story, okay? Let's plug in Pharaoh for this red dragon, okay? Can we think of something in the book of Exodus that sounds like what we're reading about the woman, Israel, giving birth to a male, and then the child being caught up to a throne? That's Moses. Okay, Moses was a male. He was a male child. Pharaoh did everything he could to stop the male children from being born, but it didn't work. So Moses was caught up to Pharaoh's throne. You know, Pharaoh's was it Pharaoh's daughter? I don't remember the relationship, but found him, brought him into to Pharaoh's court, and he was raised in the court. He was raised at Pharaoh's throne. Okay, so that was Moses, and we know that Moses was a type, a shadow of Yahshua, the Messiah. And so I think it's fair to say that there is a parallel between Moses being caught up to Pharaoh's throne and then Yahshua being caught up to Yahweh's throne. The woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by Yahweh so that there she would be nourished 1,260 days. Okay. So we know the story of the Exodus. You know, you have the big gap of time where 40 years, where Moses is exiled. He's in Midian. 40 years later, when he's 80 years old, he comes back to deliver the people. Okay. They flee into the wilderness. And then I'll come back to this in a minute. I need to go a little further down. I'm going to go back to verse 13. When the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Now, if the dragon is Pharaoh, we know that with the first Exodus, Israel escaped into the wilderness. Initially, the moment they left Goshen, they were in a wilderness. Okay, they kept going. They were through the wilderness, and then they hit the Red Sea, and they stopped. And then once Moses parts the Red Sea, Yahweh parts the Red Sea, then they're back in the wilderness on the other side. Okay, so there's basically two sections of wilderness, one between Egypt and the Red Sea, and then one after the Red Sea. Okay, and so we see the woman in the wilderness or in a place prepared by Yahweh back up in chapter 6. And then we see the same thing repeating down here in chapter 14. Okay. And the language with the two wings of the great eagle, that goes back to the first Exodus 2. When you go back and read that, Yahweh likens it to him carrying them out on wings of an eagle. So there's another parallel there. The serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. Sounds a lot like Pharaoh sending his armies out after Israel. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened his mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. This sounds to me like the opposite version of the Red Sea. The Red Sea opened up, Pharaoh's army came in, boom, swallowed him up. Except instead of being water, this is earth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of Yahweh and hold to the testimony of Yahshua. Okay, so that's a general overview. Now I'm going to back up and unpack it, hopefully even further, okay? Now, the first thing I want to point out is that I think we're dealing with actually maybe a three-phase Exodus, at least two phases to this. With the first Exodus, they just left on Passover, and then that was pretty much it, right? They were on their way out the whole time. I see a first Exodus. They're in a holding pattern for 1,260 days. Then there's another, maybe a captivity, but there's a distinct attack on them again. They have to flee again for the times and half a times. Okay? And I'll get into why I think we're dealing with two separate time periods here. Conventionally, we're taught that the 1,260 days, the times and half a times, the 42 months that it mentions in chapters 11 and 13 are all the same 3.5 year time period, right? Because 1,260 days, well, that's 3.5 years of 360 days. 360 times 3.5 is 1,260. 1,260 divided by 42 is 30, and 30, times 12, in a year, that's 30, 30-day months. That's the whole thing, right? They're equal. So you get this idea that there's a 7-year tribulation, and then halfway through that, the Great Tribulation starts, what we're talking about here, which is 3.5 years. I think it's longer. Here's why. Okay, we go back up. Take a look at some of the language here, back in verse 6. The woman fled into the wilderness. Okay, she's there for 1,260 days. Then we have the war in heaven, presumably during that time. We don't know for sure exactly, but just following it chronologically, it would maybe be during that time. Satan is kicked out, and his angels, however many there are. And then in verse 13, he goes to persecute the woman who gave birth. Then the woman is given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she could fly into the wilderness. Okay, so Yahweh has to help her out again. So we have the woman going out in the wilderness for 1,260 days. The devil persecutes her. She has to flee again, but this time it's for times and half a times. Now, I did, one of the very first videos I did was actually an audio thing, and it was called How Long is the Tribulation? And in that one, I went through my possible time frames, discussing all the alternatives to the typical 3.5 year tribulation. And I think Yahweh's smart. He's much smarter than we are. He knows we're dumb. So if we're really dealing with the same period of time, why express it three different ways? Why say 1260, 42 months, and then 3.5 times? Why not just say 1260 days? Why not just say 3.5 years? Why not just say 42 months? And I think it's for a reason. I think we're dealing with different periods of time here. Okay. And the fact that the devil persecutes the woman after she has already been in the wilderness for the 1260 days, and then it's time times and half a time back in the wilderness. I think that's back to back. That's what I mentioned, a two-phase exodus. Okay, so imagine if we go back to the first exodus. Let's say they get out of Dodge on Passover, they go to the Red Sea, but instead of crossing, Pharaoh captures them. Okay, puts them back under captivity. Great. Now what? But then Yahweh does it again and releases them again. Okay. Now, to me, in my way of thinking, the fact that Yahweh can do a miraculous exodus twice is more awesome than just doing it once. I don't know. Maybe it's just me being from Texas, where everything's bigger. I don't know. To me, that's just way more impactful. And we're talking about this exodus being bigger than the first one, right? So it makes sense that he would do it on a grander scale. He would do it in a way that shows his glory and his might and his authority in an even bigger fashion. Okay. And then this also serves another purpose, I think, because when you get into Daniel and it talks about this time times and half a time period, it says at the end of that, it says that the power of the holy people will be shattered. Okay. So imagine if you're a holy person, you're involved in this first exodus, everything's going great, you're in the wilderness for 1260 days. Yeah, this is great. And then all of a sudden, bam, you're right back in it. What a crushing blow to your faith that would be. I'm thinking, like, at that point, you got to have some serious doubts on this Yahweh who saved you. You've got to be wondering, like, wait a minute, And with the first Exodus, they were begging to go back into Egypt, right? But this time, it's actually happening, in a way. They're coming back under the captivity, and so Yahweh bails them out a second time. And to me, this is something where let me go to Ezekiel 20 and show you what I'm talking about with this. I wasn't planning on going here, but I will. Verse 33, Ezekiel 20, verse 33. As I live, declares Yahweh Elohim, surely with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out, I shall be king over you. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you are scattered, with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out. And I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there I will enter into judgment with you face to face. This doesn't sound like happy days for Yahweh's people. As I entered into judgment with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so I will enter into judgment with you, declares Yahweh Elohim. I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant, and I will purge from you the rebels and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the land where they sojourn, but they will not enter the land of Israel. Thus you will know that I am Yahweh. So I'm wondering if this is just me hypothesizing, speculating, and I guess I should disclaimer: everything I'm saying here is speculation. It's my understanding currently, subject to change. But I think it's really interesting when we look at Revelation from this whole second Exodus prism. And what's Yahweh say he's going to do there? He's going to purge out the rebels. These are the Korahs, these are the Dathans, these are the troublemakers in the camp, and these are the people that I think if everything's great during that 1260 days, if they make it through there and then all of a sudden they're back in captivity, these guys are off the wagon. They're done. They're out. But your Caleb's, your Joshua's, they're going to be the ones that hopefully understand these prophecies and know, wait a minute. Yahweh said this was going to happen. let's wait this out, have the next phase of the Exodus. And that's because prophecy is one of those things where it serves to strengthen your faith. When you see prophecy actually happen, it gives validity to the author. When the Babylonian captivity happened, Jeremiah had been prophesying for 20 some odd years. This is coming, and nobody was listening to him. And all of a sudden it happens, and it's like, whoa, Yahweh really was speaking through Jeremiah, and we ignored him. It validates Yahweh, and it validates his prophets. So to me, that just makes sense that he would do something like that in order to purge out the rebels, get the weak ones out, the ones who really aren't interested, who are just the fair weather Johnsons, and leave the actual remnant there. So that's speculation. So the dragon was enraged in verse 17 with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her seed, her children who keep the commandments of Elohim and hold to the testimony of Yahshua. So apparently, not all of Yahweh's people are involved in either one of these two phases. And that's why I said there's a possible third phase. So even with the group of people brought out in verse 6, even with the people brought out in verse 14, you might still have stragglers around who didn't get in those exoduses, but yet they still keep the commandments of Yahweh and the testimony of Yahshua. And translation, that's believers who keep Torah. I know for a lot of people that sounds crazy, but when you read the Bible cover to cover, that's the blueprint. It always was. The Torah is forever. Christ kept the Torah, the disciples kept the Torah, Paul kept the Torah. It's there, and Pauline Christianity has it to where the law, the Torah was done away with, and you can't make a scriptural case from that apart from twisting Paul's letters. You can't get that from the Old Testament prophets. You can't get it from Christ's own words. You have to go to Paul. So right there, that not quite buying that. I think the law is still in effect. So anyway, so that's the end of it, and basically the first Exodus parallel really only extends through that first part, the 1260 days, and then maybe up into where the dragon is chasing after, etc. But we obviously only had the one Exodus to first go around. If we have a two-phase Exodus, then we can't make an apples to apples comparison. It's not going to be exactly like the first one. So that's kind of basically that. I think that it is really outlining that. And then when you look at Revelation 11 and Revelation 13, you got some parallels too. The two witnesses come on the scene. That's like Moses and Aaron. And then you have the false prophet in chapter 13 doing the signs and wonders, just like the two witnesses are. That sounds a lot like Pharaoh's magicians propping up Pharaoh and his kingdom. So to me, there's enough comparisons there to say, okay, we're looking at the first Exodus as a blueprint for the second Exodus, and Revelation right here is kind of telling us how it's going to go down in a way. And of course, you want to read Daniel, you want to read Zechariah, you want to read some of the other apocalyptic literature to get more of a fleshed out detail of how it's going to look, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. Timing, I want to touch on timing. I'm going to go back and I'm going to look, I kind of already did, but I'll kind of go into it more in depth. My take, and people look at me when I present this, people look at me like I have two heads. Maybe I do. I don't know. But to me, that it's interesting. Okay, if we assume that the man, and it says, like in my translation, the NASB, she gave birth to a son. It says a male and then child. Child is italicized, which means it's not there literally. So in the literal, she gave birth to a male. You could even say she gave birth to a man. Okay, it's implied that she's giving birth to a full-grown man. So that's interesting to me. Now, if this is Yahshua, let's go back to his earthly life. When was he caught up to his father's throne? Best I can tell, there's twice. Okay, his resurrection, after he was resurrected, he's the women come see him. He's there in the garden. Mary Magdalene comes to hug him, and he's like, don't cling to me. I haven't yet ascended to my Father. So presumably he ascends to his Father that same day. And that day was most likely the Feast of First Fruits. Conventional reckoning says the Feast of First Fruits is the first day of the week, the Sunday after the Sabbath, obviously during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that would be one day he ascended. We know from the book of Acts, chapter 1, that he also ascended after he was with his disciples for 40 days. This would have been starting on the Feast of First Fruits. 40 days later would have been the 40th day of the counting of the Omer, the Feast of Weeks. You count 70, or you count seven 7 weeks, which is 49 days, plus 1 is 50. So 40 days into that, he would have ascended to his Father, for good, at least for a while, until he comes back. So you got, in my mind, two possible time markers here to look at maybe when this 1260 starts. We could be looking for either the Feast of First Fruits or the 40th day of the counting of the Omer, and then this is when the woman flees to the wilderness. Now, I can't say that's bulletproof. That's kind of speculation on my part. There is some anecdotal evidence to back it up, just based on the timing of this. It seems to tie in with the Exodus. The Exodus happened on Passover time, so it kind of makes sense that it would maybe kind of dovetail there. There is another witness, and I'm going to quote from the Septuagint. If you don't know what the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And basically, you had a bunch of Jews that lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and they wanted a Bible that they could read in their language, which was Greek. They spoke Greek. So there was a translation done in Greek for them to read the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, so to speak. And it reads different than in our Bibles. Our Bibles, the Old Testament is based on the Hebrew Masoretic, which was written in I think the 2nd or 3rd century CE by a group of Jews who were translating from apparently a Hebrew text. Okay, and that's where you got all the vowel markers and all that stuff introduced. And anyway, so that's the primary Hebrew text that's used in most of our English Bibles. But the Septuagint predates it. The Septuagint was translation started, I believe, around 300 BC, and it was an ongoing process. It didn't happen all at once, but it did predate the Masoretic, so it's older. But when we get into Jeremiah 31 in the Septuagint, okay. I'm going to read verse 8. This is from the Septuagint. Now, if you're following along in your Bible, it's not going to say this, okay? But this is what it says in the Septuagint. Behold, I'm bringing them from the north, and I will gather them from the farthest parts of the earth. Now, pause for a moment. Bringing them from the north, from the farthest parts of the earth, that's second Exodus language. That's talking about where Yahweh is bringing in all of his people that he scattered throughout the world, the remnant, Ephraim, Judah, the mixed multitude, even those grafted in. Ezekiel 37 says, Ephraim and his companions, Judah and his companions. That's the mixed multitude. That's the whosoever wills, okay? So he's bringing them in from the parts of the north and from the farthest parts of the earth. And in the Greek Septuagint, it says, at the feast of Pesach. Pesach is the Hebrew word for Passover, and it can literally mean Passover, like the day of Passover, the 14th day of the first month. It can also mean the time frame from then through the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So about an 8-day time period there is generally called Pesach, Passover. And so it specifically says that this is going to start in the Septuagint on Passover. So, take it with a grain of salt. I mean, it's the Septuagint, but I think, and I'll have to do a study on this at some point later, looking at translations. But I think that being that it's older and it's not perfect, the Septuagint definitely has its flaws. But with it being older, it kind of makes me wonder, maybe we should look at that, and like, why does it specifically say at the Feast of Passover? I don't know. But assuming that it's correct, and the Masoretic is missing that information, that dovetails right in with my theory here based on Revelation 12, that that the ingathering is going to begin at Passover time. Um, we'll see, to be determined. And this is where I think it's really important that we keep, and I think it's important to keep all of Yahweh's holy days. Forget Christmas, forget Easter, forget Halloween, Valentine's Day, all that nonsense. Those are holidays of man. Christmas is pagan. Halloween's obviously pagan. Easter is pagan. Okay, so if we're going to claim to be a Bible believing church, let's do the holy days that are in the Bible. Let's do the ones in Leviticus 23. It says these are the feasts of Yahweh. These are the feasts of the Lord. They're not the feasts of the Jews. The Jews kept them, but they weren't the only ones that kept them. Okay, these are our Creator's feasts that He designated for His people. And when you look at the word feasts, there's two words that are used. The typical word is moed or moedim for the plural, and that basically means appointed time. These are appointments that He has scheduled, that He wants to meet with His people. And we're going to blow these appointments off for these pagan holidays just because of our Christian tradition. The other word that's used for the three pilgrimage feasts, unleavened bread, Pentecost, and then tabernacles, is Chag. And a Chag that gets translated as feast then has the idea of like people like moving in a circle, so it has the connotation of like a circuit, like it's a circuit that happens, it repeats year to year, but it also has the connotation of Yahweh's people coming together and rejoicing, like dancing in a circle, and just, fellowship. The whole thing is there. And so if you're not keeping these holy days, you're missing out on a lot. And I just beg you with all my heart, give it a try. We've got the Feast of Trumpets coming up on September 30th. Okay, it's a Monday. Perfect opportunity to get started. Get your toe in the water. Take a day off work, because it is a Sabbath. You are to rest. We don't really have a lot other to do right now. We don't have the temple, all that stuff. Sacrifices are out. All it says is that it's a day of remembrance and you're supposed to have a holy convocation. So take the day off, get together with your family, get together with your friends, read the Bible, maybe pray together, and just enjoy your company as the body of Messiah on one of Yahweh's holy set apart days. And I think you'll see that if you take that leap of faith, you'll see that it's so much more rewarding than Christmas. Christmas has the last statistics. I mean, I'm sure it's consistent now. I haven't followed it in a while. The highest suicide rates of the year. People get depressed because they end up in just outrageous debt, spending money on presents for people who don't even really want them, typically, and it's just, come on. I mean, I get it's in the middle of winter. We need something, happy to kind of bring us out of that, winter blues. I get that. But celebrating a holy day that is known, it's been proven to come straight out of paganism, straight out of European paganism, possibly even Middle Eastern paganism. Come on, I just can't see how people can do that knowing the truth, and anyway, that's a whole other thing. But anyway, trumpets is coming up, and then after that, 10 days later, you have the Day of Atonement, and then you have on the 15th day of that month, so like 15 days after trumpets, you have the start of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is an excellent time. You go camping with your family. We'll be camping with a bunch of families that we fellowship. Kids get to play together for a week. You don't have to get up and go to work, and it's just great. It's just great, and you have the psalm that talks about, behold how good and how pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. That's keeping Yahweh's holy days. When you're with other believers keeping Yahweh's holy days, it's a completely different feel than keeping these Christianized, warmed over pagan holy days that everybody else keeps. So I just encourage you, take a leap of faith. Start with trumpets. It's the day of remembrance. Let's remember Yahweh. Let's remember the ancient past. Let's return to Him. And hopefully, in doing so, we can set ourselves up to be a remnant, part of this remnant that's going to make it in the second Exodus, because it talks about those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus, not just the testimony of Jesus. Okay, he could have easily left out the commandments part, but it's there. It's a two-part process. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor that point too much longer, but just a timing possibility there on when it might start. And then I mentioned earlier that I think we have two separate aspects of this: the one that's 1,260 days, and the one that's time times and half a times. The time times and half times is generally accepted to be 3.5 years. There's a word for year in both Hebrew and in Greek, and it wasn't used. He used the word for times. So I don't think he's talking about 3.5 years here. So what the time means, I don't know. I speculate on it in the audio teaching that I mentioned earlier. How long is the tribulation? I won't get into the details here. I'll let you listen to that. It's about 20 minutes. It's not a big deal. But anyway, that's Revelation 12. Just basic, trying to keep it kind of short here. And hopefully that kind of lays the groundwork. If you have any questions about this or want to discuss it, let me know on YouTube. Let me know on Facebook. If you know me in person, talk to me in person. I'd love to study it and discuss it with you. If you think I'm nuts, just tell me so. I can take it, and we can, iron sharpens iron. We can go over it, and you can present your point of view. I can present mine. We can agree to disagree, or maybe we can agree that we're both wrong and find a common ground somewhere that is correct. I don't know, but that's just me presenting my thoughts on this, and hopefully, I'm just looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to this second Exodus. The daily grind here is getting really old, and it's not, we're not doing the hard physical bondage, but I think that we're definitely under a psychological bondage. This daily drudgery that we go through in this American economy. You have to. I have to drive, 45 minutes each way from my family just to support them, and there are people that go farther. It ought not to be so. So I do think that we are in a type of bondage here, and whether it gets worse or not, I don't know, but I do look forward to the day when we are delivered from it. So I'll close it with that. It's 11 o'clock here on a Friday night, September 20th, and I hope you have a good night. I'm going to tune out for this stream, and I'm going to come right back in a few minutes when I can get my act together, and I'm going to talk about the mark of the beast, the number of the beast, and I'm going to give more details on my position on that, and kind of flesh that out, because it's been asked, if I could get into it in more detail, because with the Revelation thing, I kind of went into it in passing, but I didn't really deal too much with it, but I'll get into it more with this one. So anyway, good night, shalom in Yahshua's name, and see you next time.